What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of China Update, where I try and help you guys keep on top of the world's #2 economy. My name is Tony. If you're in quarantine at the moment, I hope you're staying safe and that you're okay. I was in quarantine for over 3 weeks in China, so I feel your pain. For those of you watching this for the first time, I work in an executive role in China, and part of my job requires that I follow the big macro developments coming out of this country for internal work as well as for clients outside of the firm. If you are interested in trying to keep on top of China or following China, I put these videos together originally to help my mates back home who were interested, and then they said you should throw the stuff up on YouTube. So if that is your bag, if that's something you're interested in, maybe consider subscribing, hit that bell button, and you'll get one of these every week. I only tell you guys here what I would be comfortable telling a paying client. So I try to keep all the BS out and just tell you guys the big stuff that you need to know. It's a huge help as well if you do like the content to smash that like button. With the disinformation that's coming out of this part of the world, coming out of China at the moment, some tech companies are trying to combat that. And so they're throttling a lot of what are perceived to be bot or fake content coming out of here. Because I'm a small channel and I'm in China and I use a VPN, I get caught in that net and my content is throttled as well. And the only way to really get around that is basically for people like you who enjoy the content to like it and tell the algorithm this is legitimate content from a legitimate creator. Okay, without further ado, let's jump into this week's China update. So first up, let's talk about Wuhan, the likely origin for this virus and where it all started for a lot of people that started following the story of the coronavirus. Of course, people who have watched me in the past know that we were actually discussing the issue here weeks before it was announced publicly and you saw the shutdown in Wuhan. Well, this week, the city of Wuhan opened after 76 days of lockdown. However, strict policies that are still in place in the city suggest that local officials are still concerned that there is risks in the city of a second wave outbreak. Schools and small businesses remain shut, and local officials are asking people to stay at home if they are able to. But you do not have a closed city like you had before, and you do not have forced stay-at-home orders like you had in the past. So there is more freedom in the city. It is opening up, and you're starting to see business return to the city. There's also still a lot of migration going out of the city, movement of peoples out of the city. The night that the city opened up on Wednesday, over 50,000 people left, many of those moving to the Pearl River Delta area. This has major cities like Canton, for example, or Shenzhen. It's likely that they went there to return to their factories. The city of Beijing was quite strict with people trying to return to that city. Those who wanted to go from Wuhan to Beijing had to get special permission. There are restrictions on movement and quotas for people moving into the city, and you also have to go through testing and in many cases go into forms of home quarantine. So the last few episodes we've been talking about the increasing concern of so-called silent cases or asymptomatic cases and how this is actually a big challenge for the government in their own coronavirus fight now. You'll remember we've discussed the dual issues of imported cases and asymptomatic cases. Well, on Wednesday, the State Council had a special meeting to pass rules and regulations within the country, specifically targeting how governments should respond to asymptomatic threats. The State Council meeting also said officially for the first time that silent carriers or asymptomatic carriers can be infectious and thus they need to be managed. You'll remember that we talked about this last week as well when I said that Monday of last week was the first time that the government officially recognized and published data about these so-called silent carriers or asymptomatic carriers. On Monday, a state media paper actually released a report online saying there was probably between 10 and 20,000 silent carriers in Wuhan. This post was later taken down. All across the country, we're seeing varying degrees of both opening up and restrictions. It seems that there are policy debates at different local levels as to how they should balance the threat of reinfection rates with the policy challenge of getting the economy back up and running. Some cities have opened up, they've got people back at work, and they're trying to get people out spending money, even calling for tourists to visit their cities. Other cities, particularly politically sensitive cities like Beijing, have been more cautious, keeping certain industries closed, particularly recreational industries. You see karaoke bars or KTV bars as they're called here, cinemas, certain types of recreational bars remain closed. And in some cases, local governments are cautioning people from going to busy restaurants. Also, a theme that we've discussed over the last few weeks is land and port cities are having difficulty dealing with citizens coming into the country. Now, even though all foreign passport holders are banned and there has been a massive reduction in flight capacity coming into the country is still having capacity issues at these port cities. Designated hotels and other quarantine facilities are at full capacity in many of these cities. In fact, this week at a border town in the northeast of China near the Russian city of Vladivostok temporarily closed its borders to all people, including Chinese citizens, as there was capacity issues on the Chinese side to bring people in. All the designated areas to hold people for quarantine were at full capacity. The government is trying to create temporary facilities to hold people. At the moment, they are on the Russian side, waiting at the border. It seems it could actually be a minor diplomatic incident with this exchange, as it seems the Russian side does not want to take them back into the city, but leave them at the border crossing. As of the filming of this, the border still remains closed. Okay, next up, let's talk about the economy. As you all know, the big challenge after shutting a country down is opening it back up. This is going to be a common policy issue that many countries are going to be facing, both in the developing and in the developed world, and China is no exception. It's one thing to shut down the second largest economy in the world. It's an entirely other challenge to open it back up. The last 2 weeks, I've had some pretty big segments looking at the economy, the economic damage that has been caused by the outbreak and the government response to the outbreak, which was to shut down huge parts of the country. And we've been looking at how the government is going to try to reopen the country. This week, I just really want to look at one particular aspect of the economy, because next week, with the release of the first quarter data, there's going to be a big episode looking specifically at the economy. A few weeks ago, I also did a special episode looking at the data for January and February. So if you are sort of a nerd like me, you like breaking down that sort of data and analysis for those first 2 months, go back and check that episode out. It just looks at the economic performance of those 2 months. Right now, however, even though there is a lot of news looking at different metrics, what I want to primarily look at now in this episode is consumer demand. How have consumers responded to this? So consumer demand and consumer confidence. We know that the Chinese economy has taken both a demand and a supply hit. We also know that because China is a major export power, 20% of its economy is driven by exports. The international pandemic is going to smash that part of the economy as well. The government wants people spending again, and to get that to happen, these people need to have both the funds to do so, but also the confidence to spend. And there are a couple of important reports that came out this week in surveys that looked into this issue of consumer confidence. So a recent survey conducted by a Chinese consulting firm focused on logistics and transportation found that 41% of participants said they would reduce spending to prepare for future crises. Only 8% expressed a willingness to do more shopping after the outbreak. Another survey conducted by an investment bank, China Renaissance, said that 68% of the people surveyed expect their income to be lower this year. So it looks like the government does have an issue on their hands, amongst many, many other issues, in bringing back that consumer confidence. The other policy issue is actually how to get funds into the hands of regular Chinese consumers. And there's been a lot of debate over the last few weeks between academics and economists and politicians within China. It's not a democracy, but you still have politicians. I guess that's a universal truth everywhere, as to how to get consumers spending money. And it seems to boil down to two main camps. One camp is calling for funds to be directly given to Chinese people, a la the US, how the US is basically given money to people. The other camp is that perhaps it would be better to give people vouchers that expire, basically forcing them to spend that money. There is issues with both of these arguments, and interestingly enough, both of these arguments have pulled away from the original plan, which was basically to pour more credit into the economy and get a supply a supply return first and keep people employed, and then that would bring back consumer confidence and consumer spending. But it seems like there has been increasing pressure to actually get money in the hands of consumers, and now the debate is exactly how do you do that, and how do you do that in a way that doesn't result in people just holding on to money because they're too scared to spend. Next up, I want to talk about the expansion of the state, and this actually could be an observation or a prediction that you can make about many economies around the world at the moment, especially in in Europe. In my own country of New Zealand, I'm also worried that the government in the future is going to increase government control over certain industries, and I'm already preparing letters to write to my representatives in New Zealand, and I think the free market in my country is going to do a much better job at the recovery than bureaucrats in Wellington. But we're not here to talk about my country of New Zealand, we're here to talk about China, and this is also a relevant challenge within China. It looks like a lot of the financial support that is coming out of the central and local governments is disproportionately helping state-owned enterprises, SOEs, which in effect is a form of nationalizing the industry, and the private sector actors cannot compete or enjoy the same support. In an effort to avoid mass unemployment, which is looks like is the major challenge that has been identified by the State Council as well as the top party apparatus, the state is attempting to employ both migrant workers and college graduates. Actually, this week, Vice Premier Sun Chunlan made a special call for Hubei, the province at the epicenter of this crisis, to employ graduates with state jobs. So we're seeing a state response to the risk of unemployment. So it seems that the government is turning to the state to provide jobs and reduce unemployment more so than the private sector. Now, these sort of moves actually greatly reverse the very few gains that the country has seen in economic liberalization efforts over the last few years, and greatly undermines overall economic dynamism at a time where China's window for effective, sustainable economic liberalization opportunities is closing. Now, next up, let's talk about China's PR efforts, its big PR push overseas. The last few weeks, we've been talking about this as a national priority for the country. China recognizes that it needs to win hearts and minds overseas, as there is increasing anger as this crisis hits not just the West, but many developing countries, including countries that had fairly positive relations with Beijing, or for, say, trade and economic reasons, are quite reliant on the world's #2 economy. Now, we've discussed in previous videos the narrative that the Chinese state has taken in terms of the origin, blame, responsibility, some of these things. We've discussed this in previous episodes. If you look over the last 4 weeks, I've told you guys how this narrative has developed, and it now seems like it's taken a firm position. Feel free to check out those previous videos if you do want to see the evolution of China's narrative when it comes to combating this, themes of responsibility, origin, those sort of things. And the last episode, you can actually see the firm stance that the government has taken. I've said from the beginning that this is a very risky PR decision, tactic, the strategy that it's taken and the narratives that it wants to push. I do think high risk, and there could be blowback to that strategy, not just in the West where it has already happened and we've discussed it in the last 2 episodes, but also in the developing world too. It should be pointed out at this point, however, that the Chinese side is sending medical teams overseas, and they are now sending a lot of aid overseas. So they have been very proactive now at helping the world respond to this pandemic. A lot of the criticisms, however, are more directed at the original response in the first few months, and then China's position now as to responsibility in those first few months. There have been some incidents over the last week. One prominent one was with Iran, for example. It was actually a pretty funny incident because you had an exchange between members from the Ministry of Health as well as the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Iran over 2 days with the Chinese side, most notably the embassy in Tehran. Now, this all occurred over Twitter, and while this tense exchange was able to be resolved with diplomats on the Iranian side, I do think it's funny that this exchange happened on a platform, Twitter, between 2 countries that both banned the platform. We also saw a full-blown diplomatic incident when the Minister of Education of Brazil said that the Chinese intentionally created the virus and spread it on the world in order to achieve their plan for world domination. Now, this very outlandish statement, of course, caused a very strong response from the Chinese side, who condemned the statement. Since that statement was made, people within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Brazil have smoothed things over. It's worth noting that Iran and Brazil have both had fairly positive relations with China in the past, and that China is their biggest trading partner. There are also reports of angry statements being made by politicians in some African countries, as well as within India. We discussed deteriorations in the diplomatic relations between some European countries and China last week, and of course the serious deterioration in China-US relations the week before. That's a thing that we've covered for several months on this program, and we're starting to see now diplomatic incidents popping up in the developed world. Now, on this theme, we move to our last part of this episode, where we talk about countries' efforts to pull their manufacturing capacity and their supply chain or supply network exposure out of China. Now, these sort of trends already had political legs in the United States before the outbreak. It was particularly acute during the trade war, and now definitely enjoys bipartisan elite and popular support. The Japanese government this week announced that they would spend upwards of $2 billion to help Japanese multinational companies get out of China in the coming months. In Europe too, it seems that there is significant political pressure to bring manufacturing back and reduce supply chain exposure from China, with strong signals coming out of Germany, France and the UK. On top of the political motivations, there also seem to be strong market incentives to push for at least diversification in supply networks and reduced exposure with having large parts of your manufacturing capacity within China. If we do move into a different era in the post-outbreak world, where there's increased uncertainty and risk with cross-border trade, that increased risk will need to be accounted for in the company's bottom line calculations, and you may see them try to reduce that exposure by bringing supply chains back to final markets or close to the final markets, or at the very least diversifying. This policy challenge has already correctly been identified by the Chinese side, and academics and economists are already debating from this week how to best respond to this, how to incentivize foreign firms to stay in China, to keep their manufacturing in China, and you'll probably see over the next few months the sort of policy response that the government will turn to. Okay guys, that's our episode. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, or if you disagree with any of my analysis, if there's anything you'd like me to talk about, or that you think I don't need to talk about, please put your comments below. I'd love to hear from you guys. Like I said before, I hope you're staying safe, and I will see you guys next time on China Update.